Alright, for today's video lecture, I would like to introduce you to the concept of civil liberties, what to look for when we're looking at Supreme Court cases, and the concepts of freedom of expression and symbolic speech. First and foremost, what are civil liberties? Civil liberties protect individuals from government interference. These are usually explicitly stated in our Bill of Rights, and they are protection of individuals. This contrasts with the idea of civil rights, which are government guarantees of political equality. So if we're looking at these two different concepts, civil liberties deal with protections of a particular individual, while civil rights look for protections over a particular group. In order to demonstrate and understand how these civil liberties impact and protect us, we're going to be looking at Supreme Court cases. And when we go through the Supreme Court cases, there's going to be three parts of a case that we're going to look at: the facts of the case, the question of law, and the conclusion. The facts of the case are going to give us the background information. What was going on that brought about a dispute, usually between a particular individual and the government. Once we get the facts of the case, then we can figure out what the question of law is. Where was the conflict of what was going on with the law, or in this case, primarily the amendment in the Constitution? And then finally, the conclusion. The conclusion is going to be, what does the Supreme Court decide, and what was their opinion, rationale for their decision? Once we have the court's decision and opinion, we then have the interpretation and guidelines from which to understand how that amendment impacts our lives today. The first set of cases we want to talk about deal with the freedom of expression, covered under the First Amendment to the Constitution. The first case we want to talk about, Schenck versus United States in 1919, dealt with a gentleman who handed out pamphlets and other circulars that were against the draft and urged people to resist the intimidation of the capitalist government in forcing people to join and go and fight over in Europe. Mr. Schenck was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act by attempting to cause insubordination in the military and to obstruct recruitment. Well, Schenck didn't feel like he should have been punished, and he challenged his punishment, claiming that his words and expressions were protected by the Free Speech Clause of the First Amendment, and that was a question before the court. The court, though, did not side with Mr. Schenck. In a unanimous decision, they stated that his pamphlet and his actions, his words, posed a clear and present danger. Our next case, Dennis versus United States in 1951. Although these utterances and these actions may be tolerable leaders of the Communist Party of America, during wartime, they are not protected, and he can be charged with violating provisions of the Smith Act. The Smith Act made it illegal to teach or advocate the overthrow of the destruction of the United States government. Well, members of the Communist Party felt that the Smith Act was wrong, and it violated the restrictions on speech protected by them in the First Amendment. Well, in the decision, the court upheld the convictions of the Communist Party leaders and found that the Smith Act did not inherently violate the First Amendment. The court found that there was a distinction between the mere teaching of communist philosophies and actively advocating those ideas. And because, once again, those ideas created a clear and present danger, the government was justified in their actions. So both of these cases show sometimes how our speech can be limited. The final part today that we want to talk about is this idea of symbolic speech covered under the First Amendment of the Constitution. The first case, United States versus O'Brien in 1968, deals with a young man by the name of David O'Brien, who burned his draft card at a Boston courthouse in protest of the Vietnam War. Mr. O'Brien was thrown in jail and convicted under a federal law which made the destruction or mutilation of a draft card a crime. The question was, though, was O'Brien's actions protected under the First Amendment freedom of speech. Writing for the court, Chief Justice Earl Warren applied the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law abridging or limiting the freedom of speech. Justice Warren said that the freedom of speech did not give O'Brien the right to burn his draft card. Warren explained that only pure speech gets full protection under the First Amendment. By contrast, O'Brien's protest involved both speech and conduct. The speech was whatever O'Brien meant to say in protest of the Vietnam War, which was protected. The conduct, though, the burning of the draft card, went against the law because Congress has the right to create a draft. So because Mr. O'Brien was infringing upon Congress's rights given to them by the Constitution, his speech was no good. If O'Brien just merely gave a speech saying he did not like the war, that would have been fine. But because he was actively infringing upon the government and their right to try to have a draft, that's where his symbolic speech ended. Our final case today, Texas versus Johnson in 1989, deals with a gentleman by the name of Gary Lee Johnson, who burned an American flag in front of Dallas City Hall in protest against the Reagan administration policies. Johnson was tried and convicted under a Texas law outlawing flag desecration. The question before the court became, was his burning of the American flag a protected form of speech under the First Amendment? And in a hotly debated and very close 5-4 decision, the court held that Johnson's burning of a flag was protected expression under the First Amendment. The court found that Johnson's actions fell into the category of expressive conduct and had a distinctively political nature. The fact that an audience takes offense to certain ideas or expressions, the court found, does not justify prohibition of speech. The court reasoned, if there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable.